Alright guys, so I'm going to be naming and shaming all the NATO parasites that are leeching off the US taxpayer. The American taxpayer is subsidizing European defense, and only one US president had the guts to call out NATO allies in this, and that of course was Donald Trump back in 2017. Now I'm going to be playing part of a speech he made back in 2017 where he called out these European countries, and then after that we're going to be looking at the numbers, and we're going to be looking at some really bad takes in the whole NATO situation, and we're going to be looking at the little playground gossips as well. These guys who completely disrespected Trump, and in disrespecting Trump, they disrespected 300 million odd American taxpayers who are funding the defense of their countries. So let's have a look at what Trump said back in 2017, and I'm going to be pausing this and commenting.
The NATO of the future must include a great focus on terrorism and immigration, as well as threats from Russia and on NATO's eastern and southern borders.
Okay, so he mentions the threat of Russia on NATO's eastern and southern borders. So that's exactly what's happening right now. You have over 100,000 Russian soldiers on the border of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is not a NATO member, but this possible attack by Russia and Ukraine comes about as a result of NATO weakness. NATO doesn't have the power to stop Russia from doing this.
These grave security concerns are the same reason that I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg.
Okay, so now he's going to mention the money
and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations.
These European countries are not paying their fair share. So here we have Macron, the president of France, Angela Merkel, who was the chancellor of Germany until recently, and Germany, France, and a whole bunch, the vast majority of these countries haven't been paying their pledge of 2%. Now, this 2% of GDP, this is a pledge of NATO countries to contribute towards NATO, towards military spending. And these countries have not been paying 2% of their GDP.
But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense.
So 23 out of 28, there are now 30 NATO members, so 2 more have joined since then. But back then, there was 23 out of 28 not paying their fair share. So only 5 countries were paying their fair share, which includes, of course, the United States. And we have the UK and some other countries. We're going to be looking at the numbers later. So here in this shot, we see this guy here. I'm going to be talking about him in a minute. Pay special attention to this guy, because you're going to see his behavior while Trump was giving his speech. And you're going to see this guy here as well, and this guy, and we'll be talking about them later. So let's have a look and see.
This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States. And many of these nations owe massive amounts of money from past years.
So Trump says they owe money. Now, technically, that's not true because this 2% is just a pledge. So it's not a binding contract. So these so-called fact checkers, after he gave this speech, they went crazy and they're trying to fact check everything Trump said. So when Trump said they owe money, they said, oh, they don't owe any money. So technically that's correct, but it misses the point that these countries are not living up to their pledge. And if they're not living up to their pledge, then what's the bloody point of it all? They're leeching off the US. It's simple as that.
And not paying in those past years. Over the last 8 years, the United States spent more on defense than all other NATO countries combined. If all NATO members had spent...
Okay, so he just said that America has spent more money in the last 8 years than all the other countries combined. So remember that. The US is by far the biggest contributor of NATO military spending. By far. So bear that thought in mind.
Just 2% of their GDP.
Now let's check out this guy here. Now look at him. He's talking while Trump is making his speech. How disrespectful can you get? Look at this.
GDP on defense last year.
Now look at him. Look at the big smile on Macron's face. This guy is gossiping to these 2 guys.
We would have had another $119 billion for our collective defense and for the financing of additional NATO reserves.
So Trump just said that in the previous year, which was 2016, if all these countries have been paying the 2% minimum, NATO would have had an extra $119 billion. So that's just in 1 year, 119 billion per year. So that would have been in 2016, the year before this. Now look at these guys. Look at these little gossips here, these playground gossips, especially this guy talking over Trump while Trump was making his speech. Completely disrespectful. There he is, look.
We should recognize that with these chronic
Unbelievable. I'm going to rewind that back and play it again.
We should recognize that with these chronic underpayments.
Unbelievable, this guy. Let's do this one more time.
We should recognize that with these chronic underpayments and growing threats, even 2% of GDP is insufficient to close the gaps in modernizing, readiness, and the size of forces.
So Trump is saying that even 2% is not even enough because of years and years, decades of neglect from these European countries not paying the 2%. He's making a point that if these countries had been paying their 2%, European defense would be extremely strong. And this situation with Putin and Ukraine probably wouldn't even be happening now if these European countries had been paying a minimum of 2%.
We have to make up for the many years lost. 2% is the bare minimum for confronting today's very real and very vicious threats. If NATO countries made their full and complete contributions, then NATO would be even stronger than it is today.
That's right. If NATO had been, these European countries been fulfilling their pledge of 2%, NATO would be way, way, way stronger than it is today. But instead what we have is a NATO that's totally dependent on the United States. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these dumb takes after Trump's speech. Trump National Security Team blindsided by a NATO speech. So they're saying that he went off the script, and even Trump's own people were surprised by the speech. They thought the president would commit to the principle of collective defense. They were wrong. And also, he surprised and disappointed European allies. Why? Why did he disappoint them? He called them out for their leeching ways, for the fact that they aren't contributing their 2% pledge. So Eastern European members worry about the threat from a resurgent Russia on their borders. Well, there you go. It's happening right now. This is back in 2017. And now we're seeing the fruits, shall we say, of NATO's lack of spending. The European countries not spending what they should be spending. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. The Russians are coming into the Ukraine. And it looks like we're going to have war. And a huge reason for this potential war is because NATO hasn't been spending the money. The European countries, they haven't been paying their fair share, as Donald Trump pointed out. So this article, Trump goes rogue, NATO speech. London tweet suggests he won't listen to anyone. So they're trying to make Trump out to be this maniac who went off the script, and how he didn't say that, well, the US will defend you European guys no matter what, even though you guys aren't contributing. And here is another one. Donald Trump improvised NATO speech and shocked National Security Team by removing Article 5 support. So Article 5 talks about how if one NATO country gets attacked, then all the other countries will come to its rescue. So mutual defense, basically. And the fact that Trump didn't mention this has shocked people. And instead, Trump went on a rant calling out the European countries that aren't paying their fair share. And this article here, you need to see how European leaders reacted to Trump's latest speech. Well, I just showed you in the video. They were gossiping schoolgirls, basically, and they didn't like being scolded. And they were trying to fact check him here, and Trump has essentially painted NATO as an organization propped up by the US. Well, we're about to see the numbers. Trump alluded to some of the numbers there in his speech. We're going to have a look at those in a second, and it's actually true. NATO is being propped up by the US. He seems to believe the US is providing defense for other countries through NATO and feels they need to pay up. Well, this is absolutely true. The US is providing defense for other countries. The US have tons of troops in Germany and other countries in Europe right now, and that's just a fact. The US taxpayers is propping up European defense. So this guy, Ivo Dadler, whatever. All NATO countries, including Germany, have committed to spend 2% of GDP on defense by 2024. So far, 5 NATO countries do so. So this guy admits that only 5 out of 28 are paying the 2%. Those who currently don't spend the 2% on defense are now increasing their defense budgets. That's a good thing. Now you see this, I've seen this sentence a lot. That's a good thing. This condescending sentence here. That's a good thing. Well, you know what? It's if they commit to the 2% in the future, fine. But what about right now? This is not happening. And this is 2024, he's saying. This is just 2 years from now. And these countries are still nowhere near the 2%. And he actually mentions Germany. We're going to be looking at Germany in a second. So now here are the numbers. So this column here is the important one. This is the share of GDP. So this is the pledge that countries are supposed to be making to pay 2% or more. Now look who's on top. The United States. 3.42% of their GDP goes on the military. So they're way over the 2%. They're 1.4% over. Next, Greece, 2.24. So Greece, they're keeping their end of the bargain. Estonia, 2.13, the UK 2.13, and Romania 2.04. Latvia and Poland just over 2. So these countries right now, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. They're paying the 2% or more. Lithuania just under. So Lithuania, I guess we'll give them a pass, 1.98, almost at 2%. Turkey is pretty close. France is pretty close, but still, France should be up to the 2%. Now let's move down here. We see Germany, 1.36%. Germany, the biggest economy in Europe, the biggest country by population in Europe, and they're only paying 1.36%. So they're nowhere near the 2%. Now let's go down here to the bottom. Who's the bottom? By far, the worst offender is Luxembourg. Just 0.55% of their GDP is going on military. Spain, the next lowest, 0.92. Then we have Belgium, 0.93. So Luxembourg and Belgium, 2 out of the 3 worst. And let's go back to these guys from that video. So let's go back to these gossip queens here. This guy, the queen of gossip, and this guy. Now most of you know this is Macron, the president of France. But who are these two guys? You may not know who they are. Let's have a look. This gossip queen is Xavier Bettel. He is the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Look at this gossip queen here in 2017, the same year Trump made that speech. And the guy here with the beard, he is none other than Charles Michel, former Prime Minister of Belgium. He is now the President of the European Council. So we have the former Prime Minister of Belgium. So he was the Prime Minister when this speech happened in 2017. Here they are, Prime Minister of Belgium, Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And in case you have the memory of a goldfish, here we go. Belgium and Luxembourg. These two countries, 2 out of the 3 biggest leeches in NATO. There we go. And these are the 2 guys gossiping and talking over Trump's speech. And this guy, he's the worst offender. He is the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. And he is the guy who's talking smack about Trump right in the middle of Trump's speech. This guy is an absolute disgrace. He's a leech. He's a parasite, and the people of Luxembourg, they are parasites. And Luxembourg has one of the highest standards of living in the world. They have one of the highest GDPs per capita, and they're not spending damn squat on their military. And yet they expect American taxpayers to bail them out, to protect them if there's an invasion of Luxembourg. And the same goes for Belgium. They're not spending money on their defense. Alright, so let's move on to Germany. Here's Angela Merkel, the former chancellor. She was the leader of Germany for God knows how long, the best part of 20 years, I think. Germany's likely new government abandons the NATO pledge. So this is in October. So this is slightly out of date. The leaders of the centre-left SDP, centre-left Greens, and free market FDP offered a commitment to NATO. But the 3 parties likely to form the next government made no mention of the 2% target. So this is the current German government. It's a coalition of 3 parties. They said, oh, we're committing to NATO, but they didn't mention the 2% target. And this is the conclusion from the Washington Examiner. Germany will continue to be the ultimate freeloader ally, exceptionally wealthy and hosting tens of thousands of US military personnel. German taxpayers and politicians are happy to have the US subsidize their social welfare systems. That's exactly what their refusal to meet the 2% target represents. A choice to put domestic needs before security and then an associated commitment to allies. So this is super important because people in the US, liberals and stuff, they talk about how in Europe they have this wonderful public healthcare system, while some Americans don't have health insurance and don't get basic health needs or whatever. But look at what's happening. The US military is subsidizing German defense, and the German taxpayers, they're benefiting from American military spending, and therefore they can spend more money on social welfare systems. They can give people more money on the dole there. They can have a public healthcare system that's reasonably good, and that's because Germany is not spending on their own military. So this is crazy leeching, it's crazy, and European taxpayers, European citizens have been benefiting greatly from American taxpayers. It's simple as that. And so guys, I think it's time for the US to take a long hard look at NATO. And as I said, Trump was the only American leader to really call out the NATO allies in this. And these Trump haters went crazy on Trump, but within America and in Europe and so on. But he's totally right. I mean, look at the numbers. These are the actual numbers. The US has contributed 6.85 trillion. And the next closest is the UK. They've contributed 655 billion. So this is just under 10% of this. So the UK, the next biggest contributor in terms of the actual raw money, is still less than 10% of what the United States has put in. Total NATO spending, less than 10% the UK. So America has spent more money than all the other countries combined. That is completely unacceptable. And you see the percentage of the GDP here. The US is way above the 2%. We have 6 other countries just barely making the 2%. And then we have all these leeches right here. Look at them. Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, even Canada. So US neighbor Canada, they're just as bad as the European countries. 1.27%. They're like on the lower end. Italy, terrible, 1.22. So these big major Western European countries are not paying their fair share. The UK is the only one, over 2%. France is kind of close, but again, they should be at the 2%. And Germany, they're an absolute disgrace, 1.36%, the biggest economy in Europe, absolutely disgraceful. And it's time for America to call a halt to subsidizing Germany. It's simple as that. So there you go, guys. That's my rant. American taxpayers are getting screwed by NATO. And it's time for, really, the American taxpayers just need to call a halt to this and put pressure on the US leaders. Biden seems to have gone back to the old, well, we're going to help these NATO allies no matter what. And Trump was the only president with balls to call out these European allies. Simple as that. Okay, guys, let me know what you think. What do you think of this situation? Should these NATO countries pay up? Should America threaten to pull out of NATO? Subscribe, leave a comment. So I'm going to be doing more videos on what happens between Russia and Ukraine. See you guys later.